There was a clank and a gurgling hiss as Klein continued tinkering with the boiler system. This was one of the two boilers and heat sink arrays connected to the primary port engine, and he had been careful to make sure that nothing too important was being taken offline during his experimentation. But still, his co-worker, an alien named Arkol, and also a conscript of the Zeltar Navy, kept hovering around anxiously. Arkol could feel a great deal of his anxiety being dulled by the mandatory chemical nanomachines that the Zeltar seeded amongst conquered species for compliance. But there was still a distinct undercurrent of fear and worry he could feel cutting through the dullness. It was a very familiar feeling, as Klein had been tinkering with this setup for the better parts of the past fortnight, coming down here after each shift and unattaching and reattaching pieces and parts here and there. The biggest thing that baffled Arkol was that Klein seemed to be very enthusiastic about the cargo their container craft was hauling. The role chosen for them, for the glory of the Zeltar Empire, had been simple feedstock transportation. Great agro-worlds that exported grain had no use for the husks and rinds of their primary crop. And so the ship they rode upon, Gonza's Pride, was one of many container ships that simply hauled this waste across systems to be dumped for livestock on meat worlds, stinking, rocky planetoids that were covered with little else beside mindless domesticated and fattened animals, their food and their byproducts. Arkol knew that the Zeltar Empire was not one to waste, and that there were container ships of even lower rankings than their own who were to haul this byproduct back to the agro-worlds, the thought of which summoning a wave of revulsion that even the compliant chemical cocktail of the nanomachines was unable to fully dull and remove. But Klein had taken a heap of the green husks and rinds, crushing them as best he could, and introducing them to what had once been a primary boiler chamber. He added something else, something that he would only tell Arkol was from his devastated homeworld, and that it was the magic ingredient. But Arkol had been unimpressed, to say the least. The apparatus had bubbled and stunk ominously, hissing with escaped gases whenever Arkol had seen the human messing with and tinkering with it. But then finally, after a few weeks of tending, whatever Klein was making appeared to reach a critical point, and he adjusted levers and valves and increased the heater coil until the concoction he strained was boiling merrily. All of this was still utterly unfamiliar to Arkol, but evidently it was going well, judging by how pleased Klein was during the tinkering and tuning and refining. Finally, at the end of his shift, nearly a month after Klein had finished his strange device, the human leaned over to him and murmured during their active shift, "I think it's done. Meet me on the subdeck at 2100 sharp." Arkol did as requested and sat there on the subdeck, wringing his claws in anxiety when Klein came proudly strutting up, holding a small glass and steel refreshment tube, the kind normally filled with the lightly flavored and pressurized drinks the Zeltar Navy distributed to its conscript sailors. However, the liquid inside was utterly clear, surprising to Arkol given how murky and brown the initial sludgy solution had been, but he knew at a glance it was not ordinary water either. Klein popped the cap off, going to take a whiff and whistling in appreciation, saying, "Hot damn, that'll put some hair on your chest." He glanced to Arkol, or, scales on your thorax. The alien bobbed nervously, and Klein gave him a reassuring chuckle. "Oh, don't worry. I checked to make sure that this is safe for your species. It's actually surprisingly safe for almost all species on board." He paused, "at least in small doses." Nodding uncertainly, Arkol took a very small sip of the liquid before wincing and coughing, hacking as it felt like his throat was on fire. "What poison is," he started to say, but then cut short as he felt the burning from his throat transfer down into his belly, a warmth filling it and feeling oddly soothing. However, even as the warmth of the drink was filling him, Arkol could still feel the anxieties and worries build. In fact, they felt more severe now than they had ever before, and Arkol started to hyperventilate slightly until Klein put a reassuring hand on his shoulder, looking him in the eyes and saying, Hey, it's okay. Just breathe. You're okay. A shot of liquor won't do you in." "A shot of what?" asked Arkol. Moonshine. Hooch. Firewater. Alcohol," Klein clarified. Arkol frowned. Alcohol is just a chemical group. That's not really that helpful of a distinction. Oh, sorry, it's ethanol, clarified Klein. Arkol nodded and then pulled up his data pad, specifically opening the first aid application and running a search for how much ethanol was safe for his species to consume. He gave a squawk of alarm as it came back with an answer of 0 and a recommendation not to imbibe any of the liquid. Klein shushed him, chuckling, and said, "Don't worry. Here, ask it what the anticipated effects and duration are for imbibing just a few milliliters." Arkol, hesitantly wondering if he had just poisoned himself, ran the clarification Klein requested, and the results indicated that there could be effects ranging from impaired judgment and slowed motor reflexes to loss of balance and nausea. Near the bottom, it noted that none of the effects were expected to be permanent and all should be well after just an hour or two. Klein reassured him, "Probably even less, even with your faster metabolism. A sip of moonshine shouldn't knock you on your ass." Arkol nodded but could feel the panic rising in his throat, and the feeling began to translate to hyperventilating again before it was sidetracked by a realization that he had not felt like this since he was a child. He had always been an anxious adolescent, and Arkol had felt those anxieties, as well as a great deal of his passions and stronger feelings, washed away with the ingestion of his first dose of required Zeltar nanomachines. But now that dullness was gone, and he could feel nothing stopping the wave rising in his mind. He started to hyperventilate again, feeling the walls closing in around him when Klein again looked him in the eyes and said calmly, as if Arkol was a spooked animal, "Hey, I want you to stay with me and go through some exercises here. What are 5 things you can see?" Arkol's eyes darted nervously around, and he named them as he could see them. "You, the boiler system you've been messing with, the control panel, the door, and the railing for the stairs." "Excellent," said Klein. "Okay, now what are 4 things you can hear?" Arkol's large ears flared and twitched, and he said, "Distant footsteps, walking away, the rumble of the engine, our voices, and the sound of liquid running through the piping around us." "Good. So now what are 3 things you can feel?" The alien touched his work jacket, saying, "My jacket, the metal railing here, and this glass with the drink you've given me." "Okay, what are 2 things you can smell?" Arkol frozen, confused. "I smell? What's that supposed to mean?" Klein swore. "Shit, I forgot your species doesn't have nostrils. Let's see. Oh wait, your species has sensitivity to magnetic fields, right?" Arkol nodded, and Klein said, "All right, then tell me what 2 fields you can feel." Concentrating on his inner orientation organs, Arkol murmured, "Well, the engines generate a field," but as he concentrated more, he could also feel another subtle field being generated by the electrical panel and wirings that were part of the boiler control system, and the electromagnetic field from the control panel. "Great," the human said. "Last thing is, what's something you can taste?" Arkol made a face. "Whatever the hell that drink was you gave me, this alcohol." Klein chuckled and laughed, but with a genuine expression asked him softly, "How do you feel?" Arkol was introspective for a moment, but realized that the surging panic he felt had passed, and it was not replaced by the dull, aching indifference that the nanomachines exuded, but instead just simple calmness, the panic having fully subsided. "I feel okay, actually, but I think the nanomachines may have had something happen to them." "I noticed that as well. I took a sip earlier this afternoon. I could feel everything get a little bit sharper, able to remember things a little bit better. I've got to say, I really appreciate not having my edges cut down by an empire that prefers me to be passive." Arkol nodded in agreement, although if it weren't for the human's help with his rising panic, he might still be tempted to exchange dull reactions for a lack of unreasonable fear. He then turned to Klein, eyeing the concoction in his hand before turning in the direction of their enormous cargo hold. "Can this reaction scale up?" Arkol asked. Klein chuckled. "It would take a little bit of doing. But yeah, in theory, you could get a possible yield out of basically everything we have in these storerooms right now. It's starch-rich, so it would just be a matter of processing and distilling. But from a few heaps of rinds, we got that much," said Klein, hefting at the half-liter bottle of Hooch. "Just imagine the booze sitting locked away amidst all that cattle-feeding compost." Arkol had seen what humans called cattle, and knew that most of the meat world had species that were distinctively more tentacled and less milk-rich than the humans' domesticated animal choice. But the sentiment still stood. "Now we just have to figure out who we want to have a taste of this next," said Arkol, warming to the idea of life without the Zeltar influence on his own body chemistry. Klein chuckled as he pulled out a trio of small metal cups. "What do you say we go pay the captain a visit?" "The what?" Arkol gasped in a startled yelp. Soon the two of them were seated in front of the captain, whose species resembled an enormous snake on the lower half, leading into a pair of beaked heads and a trio of arms. The arms were turning glass and the liquid within it over and around, examining it with both intense curiosity and healthy suspicion. "So you're saying you made this?" said Letty, the head closest to Klein. Arkol had heard him nickname that head of the captain Lefty, although he wasn't eager to repeat the human colloquialism in case the captain took it as an insult. "Yes, ma'am," said Klein proudly. "And you thought it would be acceptable to break nearly every regulation in the book regarding appropriate use of cargo?" asked Risa, the captain's other head. "Well," said Klein casually, with more than a little bravado, "I figured it was worth stealing a few tufts of green rind and mallow husk out of the mouth of a poor, defenseless, dumb animal to test a theory. And my hunch was right." The captain shook both of her heads and Lita asked, "What do you mean?" Klein explained, "Well, when the Zeltar conquer a world, they have some pretty specific instructions on what was no longer culturally allowed anymore, and I picked up on a theme. I noticed that for your species, there are some battle victory celebration drinks that seem to dominate your list of forbidden drinks." Lita and Risa shrugged, their heads moving oddly asynchronously. "Well, we haven't had many battles, so it makes sense that they would be de-emphasized in that context." "Well, Captain," said Klein, "you told me yourself that your people used to be fierce warriors, proud explorers, and unmatched fighters. Doesn't it strike you as odd that the Empire's never really focused on your people leading any sort of battle sorties? I can't remember one of your kind being so much as a private, let alone a general or a platoon commander." Risa narrowed her eyes. "What are you suggesting, human?" she said. But even Arkol could tell that he had struck a resonant nerve, as it often seemed like the captain was frustrated by how peacefully they had to deal with transactions and loading and unloading manifests. Klein took the glass he had worked on and poured a small drink into each of the glasses. "You felt as much as any of us have, the feeling of having your senses dulled, your instincts and desires tamped down. Well, this drink is, at least on Earth, traditionally used to loosen things up, as it were. The universal lubricant, some called it." With suspicion, the captain took it, and Risa continued watching the human and Arkol as they both sipped their own drinks. Lita, on the other hand, threw down the drink in a single chug, coughing and her eyes widening as she felt the same burning sensation Arkol now felt. But while Arkol's instinct was to panic, the captain's species took a different tack. Standing so quickly she bumped into and nearly knocked over their desk, the captain roared in unison at Klein, "What the hell is this here?" Lita's voice sounded a little bit hoarse. As she reached over and handily lifted the fully grown adult human with one arm, the captain paused and put Klein back down. "I'm angry," she said, looking over at the desk with various decorations knocked askew, and up at the human again. "Like, actually angry, how I remembered being a long time ago." After a tactful moment, Klein piped up, "Not still angry at me, I hope, no?" he offered with a meek smile. She chuckled, calming down, and said, "No, not anymore. That has a hell of a kick I wish you'd warned me about." She paused, looking down at the half-full bottle once more. "You know, I think there's a whole lot more good we could do in this thrice-damned empire." Arkol muffling a squeak at her heretical blasphemy, then dropping off a bunch of feedstock for some animals who don't know they're being fattened for slaughter. She looked up at the human and the other alien and said, "How do you boys feel about a change of professions?" Deep in the bowels of the ship's waste processing, a long-disused sensor finally awoke and began activating. It was designed to sense inactivated nanomachines among the crew, and instead of receiving the scant handful that had fallen apart from age, it was now receiving a flood of them. The sensor was hardwired to the ship's long-range communications array, and independent of any action or knowledge of anyone on board. An alert was sent to the Zeltar Ministry of Conformance. However, the priority of such a message for a single non-military vessel, carrying a cargo of what was as close to worthless trash as the Empire even deemed to handle, was low. By the time an investigation was launched and scouts were sent to learn more about this rogue vessel, the Gonza's Pride had already been renamed and reborn. When the scouts arrived at its last known location, the Rum-Runner was nowhere to be found.